Bring cash if you want to join us, my daughter said. I arrived with a secret that changed everything. Attention. Have you ever reached a moment in your life when the people you loved most looked at you, as though you had nothing left to offer? If you have, then you'll understand exactly how I felt on the day my own daughter called me with words I never imagined hearing. My name is David. And for most of my life, I believed that being a good father meant sacrificing quietly, expecting nothing in return except seeing my child happy. I worked long days, missed birthdays with friends, ignored my own dreams, and spent every dollar I could spare making sure my daughter, Millie, never had to struggle the way I did. Watching her grow into a successful young woman made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. At least that's what I believed until one phone call shattered the picture I had built in my heart. When Millie invited me to a family dinner, I thought she finally wanted to spend time with me after months of silence. Instead, her voice turned cold as she said, "Dad, if you're coming, make sure you bring cash. Everyone is contributing and I don't want you showing up empty-handed." Those words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. She never asked how I was doing. She never wondered whether I was lonely. The only thing that seemed to matter was whether I could bring money. I quietly agreed, but after hanging up, I stared at the old photographs covering my living room wall. Every picture told the story of a father who had given everything without asking for applause. Looking at those memories, I realized something had changed between us, and it hadn't happened overnight. What Millie didn't know was that I had been keeping a secret for months, one that would completely change the way my family saw me. I wasn't planning to embarrass anyone or seek revenge. I simply wanted the truth to come to light at the right moment. That dinner would become the most unforgettable night of our lives, not because of the money everyone expected me to bring, but because of the surprise I had carried in my heart for far too long. The morning after Millie's phone call, I woke up much earlier than usual, even though I had barely slept. Her words had followed me through the night like a voice that refused to fade. Bring cash if you're coming. I kept repeating that sentence in my mind, wondering how we had reached a point where my value as a father seemed to depend on the amount of money I could place on a dining table. I made myself a simple breakfast, but after one bite I pushed the plate away. My appetite had disappeared. Instead, I poured a cup of coffee and walked through my quiet house, stopping in front of an old wooden cabinet filled with family photographs. There was Millie, at 6 years old, wearing a bright yellow raincoat, smiling with 2 missing front teeth. Another picture showed her on the day she graduated from high school, throwing her arms around me while telling everyone I was the best father in the world. Looking at those pictures, I found it hard to believe that the same daughter now spoke to me like a stranger. I wasn't angry. If anything, I was heartbroken because I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when our relationship had started slipping away. After my wife passed away years earlier, I'd promised myself that Millie would never feel alone. I worked overtime, skipped vacations, and sold the small fishing boat I loved so she could attend the college of her dreams. Every difficult decision seemed easy because it was for her future. When she graduated with honors, I stood in the crowd with tears in my eyes, convinced that every sacrifice had been worth it. Over time, however, success changed her life in ways I hadn't expected. She found a high-paying job, moved into an elegant neighborhood, and began spending time with people who measured success by expensive cars, luxury vacations, and designer clothes. At first, she still called every weekend, then once a month, and eventually only when there was a birthday, a holiday, or some family gathering. I always told myself she was simply busy building her career. I made excuses because accepting the truth hurt too much. A few months before that phone call, I had noticed another change. Whenever we met, Millie seemed embarrassed by my old pickup truck, my faded jackets, and the modest way I lived. She would politely suggest restaurants that were far beyond my budget or recommend buying newer clothes because, in her words, appearances mattered. I would smile and change the subject, pretending her comments didn't sting. What she never understood was that I could have lived much differently if I had chosen myself over my family years ago. There were decisions I had made in silence that no one knew about, decisions connected to the secret I had carefully protected. As I stood there holding one of our old photographs, my phone buzzed with another message from Millie. It wasn't asking how I felt or whether I needed anything. It simply read, "Dinner is at 7. Please don't forget the cash." I looked at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone back into my pocket. A quiet smile crossed my face, not because her message made me happy, but because I realized that by the end of that dinner, everyone at the table would finally understand who David really was, and why the surprise I was bringing had nothing to do with money. Slipped my phone back into my pocket and stood silently in my living room, surrounded by memories that seemed more alive than the people who had created them. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think honestly about everything I had hidden from Millie. Keeping my secret had never been about testing my family or proving a point. I simply wanted to know whether the people closest to me still loved David, the father, or only cared about what David could provide. I took a deep breath, reached for the small envelope hidden safely inside my jacket, picked up the framed photograph, and walked toward the front door, completely unaware that before the night was over, every person inside that house would see me in a way they never had before. Paused at the front door for a few seconds before ringing the bell, trying to calm the mixture of sadness and determination inside me. Through the glass panels I could hear laughter, music, and the sound of dishes being placed on the dining table. It felt strange knowing that everyone inside was enjoying themselves while I stood outside wondering whether I truly belonged there anymore. A moment later the door opened, and Millie greeted me with a smile that seemed practiced rather than heartfelt. She hugged me quickly, but it was the kind of hug that ended before it really began. Her eyes immediately drifted toward my hands, as though checking whether I had brought what she expected. "Hi, Dad. I'm glad you made it," she said before lowering her voice. "You remembered what I told you, right?" I nodded politely without answering. "We'll talk about it later," I said. She looked uncertain for a moment, but stepped aside to let me in. The house was beautiful, far larger than the one where she had grown up. Expensive paintings decorated the walls. Elegant furniture filled every room, and fresh flowers covered the dining table. I couldn't help smiling, remembering the little girl who once thought a homemade blanket fort in our living room was the greatest palace in the world. Life had certainly changed. Several relatives walked over to greet me, offering polite smiles and short conversations before returning to their groups. Some asked about my health, while others simply nodded and continued talking about vacations, investments, and business opportunities. I listened quietly, realizing how little I had in common with many of the conversations taking place around me. They spoke about success as if it could only be measured in dollars, while I silently measured mine by memories, loyalty, and the people I had loved. Millie introduced me to a few of her friends from work. They shook my hand respectfully enough, but I noticed the curious expressions on their faces as they glanced at my old jacket and worn shoes. One man joked that I reminded him of his grandfather because I still drove an old pickup truck. I smiled and laughed along with everyone else. There was no reason to take offense. People often judged what they could see because they never imagined there might be more hidden beneath the surface. Few minutes later, I noticed a donation box sitting near the dining room entrance with a small sign explaining that everyone was contributing toward the purchase of a luxury vacation package for a close family member who had recently celebrated a major promotion. Guests were placing envelopes inside while congratulating one another. It became clear why Millie had insisted that I bring cash. She wasn't asking for help because the family needed it. She wanted every guest to contribute. Equally so, no one would appear less generous than the others. As I stood there reading the sign, Millie quietly walked beside me. "Dad," she whispered with an uneasy smile, "everyone has already added their contribution. You can put yours in whenever you're ready." I looked at the box, then back at my daughter. "I'll wait until everyone is seated," I replied calmly. She seemed uncomfortable with my answer, but nodded anyway. Throughout the evening, I noticed her checking the donation box several times, almost as though she feared I might embarrass her in front of her guests. That thought hurt more than I wanted to admit. The little girl who once ran into my arms after every school day now seemed worried that I might damage the image she had carefully built. When dinner was finally announced, everyone gathered around the long table, laughing and sharing stories. I took my seat near the end of the table, placing the wrapped photograph beside my chair while keeping the small envelope safely inside my jacket. I could feel the weight of the secret against my chest, knowing that the moment to reveal it was drawing closer with every passing minute, even though no one around that table had the slightest idea that the greatest surprise of the evening had nothing to do with the cash they were expecting from me. As everyone settled into their seats, the room filled with cheerful conversation and the clinking of glasses. The dining table was covered with elegant dishes that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Guests complimented the decorations, praised the chef, and laughed at stories from work and recent vacations. I sat quietly near the end of the table, listening more than speaking. Over the years, I had learned that silence often revealed more about people than words ever could. Every now and then, Millie glanced in my direction, forcing a smile before returning to entertain her guests. It was obvious she was distracted. She kept looking toward the donation box in the corner of the room, as though worrying that I might forget why I had been invited. I wished she understood that I had never forgotten. I simply had a different plan for the evening. Dinner began with everyone helping themselves to generous portions of food. Conversations drifted from business investments to expensive homes, luxury cars, and future travel plans. One guest proudly described purchasing a sports car that cost more than my entire house. Another spoke about buying a vacation property by the lake, while someone else joked that life was too short to settle for anything ordinary. I smiled politely whenever someone looked my way, but inside I couldn't stop thinking about how different my definition of wealth had become over the years. To me, wealth had always been measured by the people willing to stand beside you when there was nothing to gain. After a while, Millie stood up and gently tapped her glass to get everyone's attention. The room grew quiet. She thanked everyone for coming and spoke about how grateful she was to have such supportive family and friends. She mentioned how everyone had generously contributed to the celebration and smiled proudly toward the donation box. Then, almost as an afterthought, she looked directly at me. "I know Dad hasn't had a chance yet," she said with a small laugh, "but I'm sure he'll add his contribution before the evening is over." A few guests chuckled politely, assuming it was harmless humor, but I felt every eye in the room turned toward me. For a brief moment, the house became completely silent. I could have reached into my pocket, placed an envelope into the box, and ended the awkward moment. Instead, I calmly picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip, and smiled. "Yes," I replied in a steady voice. "I brought exactly what I intended to bring." My answer seemed to confuse everyone. Millie forced another smile and quickly changed the subject, but I noticed the concern in her expression. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about how the evening might look in front of her guests. As dinner continued, several relatives began sharing old family memories. One uncle recalled the years when I worked 2 jobs without taking a single vacation. Another remembered how I had volunteered to rebuild a neighbor's home after a storm destroyed part of it. Listening to those stories reminded me that not everyone had forgotten who I was. Some people still remembered the man behind the gray hair and simple clothes. Millie listened quietly but rarely added anything. It was as though those memories belonged to someone she barely recognized anymore. When dessert was served, the atmosphere became lighter again. Yet I could feel the evening approaching its turning point. My heart remained calm because I knew I wasn't carrying anger into that room. I was carrying truth. Slowly, I reached into my jacket and touched the sealed envelope that had remained hidden all night. Then I looked at the wrapped photograph resting beside my chair. Before revealing what was inside the envelope, there was one memory I wanted my daughter to see again. A memory that would remind her of the father she once loved before money became more important than the man who had spent his entire life believing that her happiness was worth every sacrifice he had ever made. I slowly picked up the wrapped photograph and stood from my chair. The conversations around the table faded as everyone turned to look at me. I wasn't used to being the center of attention, but for the first time in many years, I felt it was important to speak from my heart. Before I give anyone what I brought tonight, I began calmly, I'd like to share something that means more to me than money ever could. Millie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I could tell she was hoping I would keep my words short. But this was a moment I had carried inside me for far too long. I gently removed the wrapping paper and revealed the framed photograph. Several people leaned forward to get a better look. It showed a much younger version of me with 10-year-old Millie sitting proudly on my shoulders at the county fair, both of us laughing without a care in the world. The picture was slightly faded with age, but the happiness in our faces had never faded at all. I held it up so everyone could see. Do you remember this day, Millie? I asked with a warm smile. She looked at the photograph for several seconds before quietly nodding. Of course I do, she replied softly. You won me that giant teddy bear after trying nearly every game at the fair. A few guests smiled as she spoke. That's right, I said. What you probably don't remember is that I spent almost all the money I had that week trying to win it. I knew it wasn't the smartest financial decision, but when I saw the joy on your face, I forgot about everything else. The room became silent again. I continued speaking, not to make anyone feel guilty, but simply to remind them that love often hides inside ordinary sacrifices. I shared stories of late nights working overtime, missing meals so Millie could have everything she needed for school, repairing old clothes instead of buying new ones, and quietly putting aside my own dreams, because seeing her succeed was enough for me. None of those sacrifices had ever felt like burdens. They had been choices made out of love. As I spoke, I noticed several relatives lowering their eyes. They remembered those years better than anyone. They had watched me carry responsibilities without complaining. Millie stared at the photograph, a confident expression slowly giving way to something I hadn't seen in a long time, reflection. I walked around the table and carefully placed the framed picture in front of her. This isn't an expensive gift, I said. It doesn't have a price tag that impresses anyone. But it's a reminder of a time when we measured happiness differently. Millie gently touched the frame with her fingertips, but didn't say a word. Her husband quietly looked from the photograph to me, as though realizing there was far more to our family story than he had ever known. I returned to my seat, reached into my jacket once again, and rested my hand on the sealed envelope. Everyone noticed the movement, and the room grew completely still. Some guests probably assumed it contained the cash Millie had been expecting all evening. Others sensed that something much more important was about to happen. I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes before finally looking at my daughter. The photograph reminds us where we've been, I said gently, but this envelope explains where my life has been heading these past few months. I took a slow breath, placed the envelope carefully on the table in front of me, and watched as curiosity spread across every face. No one spoke. They simply waited, unaware that the documents inside that ordinary brown envelope were about to reveal a truth that would forever change the way my family looked at me, at themselves, and at everything they believed they knew about David. For several long seconds, no one said a word. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the brown envelope resting in front of me. The laughter that had filled the house earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by a silence so deep that I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. I gently placed my hand on top of the envelope but didn't open it immediately. Instead, I looked around the table at the faces of relatives, old friends and Millie's guests. Some looked curious, others confused, and a few seemed uncomfortable, as though they were beginning to realize this dinner had become something far more meaningful than they had expected. I smiled softly and said, "Before I show you what's inside, I want you all to know that I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I didn't come to prove that I'm better than anyone sitting at this table. I came because I love my family, especially my daughter. No amount of disappointment could ever change that." Those words seemed to catch Millie by surprise. She lowered her eyes and quietly folded her hands together. I continued, "Over the last few years, I've watched my family become busier, more successful, and more focused on building comfortable lives. There's nothing wrong with success. I spent my entire life hoping Millie would have opportunities I never had. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling as though I had become invisible. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. Conversations became more about money than memories. I kept asking myself one question. If I had nothing left to give financially, would the people I love still want me around? No one interrupted. Even the guests who barely knew me listened carefully. I slowly opened the envelope and removed several neatly organized documents. They weren't banknotes or checks. They were legal papers, property records, and a handwritten letter. I placed them carefully on the table without handing them to anyone yet. About 8 months ago, I said, I received news that changed my life. Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks. Millie leaned forward slightly, her expression filled with uncertainty. A distant relative whom many of you probably never met passed away. We hadn't spoken often, but years ago, when he lost everything after a business failure, I was one of the few people who stayed in touch with him. I visited him when others forgot him. I never expected anything in return. I paused for a moment before continuing. After he passed away, I learned that he had left me a substantial inheritance. Not because I was wealthy, not because I was successful, but because, in his own words, I treated him with kindness when he had nothing left to offer. The room fell into complete silence again. Millie looked at me with wide eyes, clearly trying to understand what she had just heard. I calmly slid one of the documents across the table toward her. These papers confirm that I now own several valuable properties and investments. Financially, I no longer have to worry about the rest of my life. A quiet gasp came from one end of the table. Someone whispered, "I had no idea." I nodded gently. Very few people did. I chose not to tell anyone because I wanted to see whether love would find its way to me without the promise of money. I looked directly at Millie, not with anger, but with sadness. When you called and told me to bring cash if I wanted to join the family dinner, I realized that tonight was the right time to stop hiding the truth. But the greatest surprise isn't what's written in these documents. I lifted the handwritten letter from the table and held it carefully in my hands. The greatest surprise is the decision I've already made about everything I inherited. Every face in the room turned toward the letter, and I could see hope, curiosity, and uncertainty mixing together. Millie's eyes filled with emotion as she realized that whatever I was about to reveal next would shape not only the future of our family, but also the future of the fortune everyone had just discovered. I held the handwritten letter in my hands for a few moments before unfolding it. The paper was slightly worn from the number of times I'd read it over the past several months. Every sentence reminded me why I had kept my inheritance a secret. Looking around the table, I could see that everyone was waiting for me to reveal what I had decided to do with it. Some of the guests glanced at one another with quiet curiosity, while a few relatives looked as though they were already imagining how the money might change our family's future. Millie remained completely silent. Her eyes moved from the letter to my face, and for the first time that evening, I didn't see confidence or pride. I saw uncertainty. Taking a slow breath, I began to read aloud. "David, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I know you'll wonder why I chose you. The answer is simple. When everyone else walked away from me because I had nothing left, you kept showing up. You never asked what I could give you. You only asked whether I was eating well and whether I needed company. Money comes and goes, but character stays with a person until the very end. I hope this gift reminds you that kindness always leaves a legacy." As I lowered the letter, the room remained completely still. Several relatives quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Even people who had never met the man who wrote the letter could feel the sincerity behind his words. I carefully folded the paper and placed it back on the table. "For months," I said calmly, "I've been thinking about what to do with everything I inherited. I could have bought a bigger house, driven a luxury car, or traveled the world. Instead, I asked myself a different question. If someone trusted me because of my kindness, shouldn't I use that gift to continue spreading kindness?" No one spoke. Every person waited for my next sentence. A few weeks ago, I signed the paperwork to establish a charitable foundation in memory of my late wife. Its purpose is to help struggling single parents, provide scholarships for hardworking students who cannot afford college, and support elderly people who have been forgotten by their families. The legal process is nearly complete. A wave of surprise spread across the room. One of my cousins quietly whispered, "You already did all of that?" I smiled and nodded. Most of it is already in motion. I didn't want to make promises. I wanted to take action. Millie looked stunned. "Dad!" "You never told me," she said softly. "No," I replied gently. "Because I wanted my decisions to come from my heart, not from anyone else's expectations." I paused before continuing. "The inheritance changed my financial situation, but it didn't change who I am. I spent my whole life believing that wealth is only meaningful when it improves someone else's life." Millie lowered her head, and I noticed tears beginning to form in her eyes. Her husband quietly reached over and held her hand. Around the table, the mood had completely changed. Earlier that evening, people had talked about luxury vacations and expensive purchases. Now, no one mentioned money at all. They were thinking about something much bigger. I looked directly at my daughter and said, "Millie, this dinner was never really about cash. It was about something much more valuable. I wanted to know whether my place in this family depended on what I could contribute financially, or simply on the fact that I'm your father." She couldn't answer. The silence between us carried years of misunderstandings, unspoken regrets, and missed opportunities. After another long pause, I reached into the envelope one final time and removed a smaller sealed document. "There is still one more decision I haven't shared with anyone," I said quietly. "Not even my attorney knows I plan to reveal it tonight." Every person at the table leaned forward again as I carefully placed the sealed document in front of me, knowing that what was written inside would affect Millie more personally than anything she had heard so far. As I placed the smaller sealed document on the table, every eye in the room followed it. The silence felt heavier than ever, yet my heart was strangely peaceful. I had carried these truths alone for months, and now they were finally finding their way into the open. I gently rested my hand on the document and looked directly at Millie. Tears were already running down her cheeks, but I could tell she still didn't know what to expect. "Before I open this," I said quietly, "I want you to understand something. Nothing I've shared tonight was meant to punish you. I never wanted to make you feel ashamed. Every parent makes sacrifices, hoping their children will live better lives. And I would make those same sacrifices all over again if I had the chance. My only regret is that somewhere along the way, we stopped talking to each other with open hearts." Millie covered her mouth with her hand as she tried to hold back her emotions. Her husband squeezed her hand gently but remained silent. The guests, who had been chatting so confidently earlier, now looked as though they were witnessing something deeply personal, something no amount of money could ever buy. Slowly, I broke the seal and removed a single page. "This document," I explained, "contains the final instructions for my estate." A quiet murmur spread through the room before fading again. "When I first received my inheritance, I planned to divide everything equally between my family and the charitable foundation. It seemed like the fair thing to do. My attorney prepared all the paperwork exactly that way." I paused, letting those words settle. Millie looked up with hopeful eyes. "But after spending the last several months thinking about what truly matters, I realized that money can solve financial problems, but it cannot repair broken relationships. Love, respect, honesty, and forgiveness have to come first." I placed the document on the table where everyone could see my signature at the bottom. So I changed my will. The room became completely still. "The charitable foundation will still receive the majority of my estate because I made that promise to myself and to the man whose kindness changed my life. But I also created something else." I reached into the envelope again and took out a small set of keys, attached to a simple silver keychain. "A few months ago, I bought a modest lakeside cottage. It's not a mansion. It isn't filled with expensive furniture, but it sits beside a quiet lake where your mother and I once dreamed of retiring together." I held the keys in my hand for a moment, before placing them gently in front of Millie. She stared at them in confusion. "Dad!" "What does this mean?" she whispered. I smiled sadly. "That cottage belongs to you." Her eyes widened. "But there's one condition." Everyone around the table listened carefully. "You can't sell it for profit. You can't rent it out. You can't use it as an investment. The only purpose of that place is to bring family together. If one day you have children of your own, I want them to know what it feels like to sit around a fireplace, tell stories, fish by the lake, laugh, without looking at their phones. And remember that the richest moments in life rarely cost anything. Millie burst into tears. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and slowly walked toward me. "Dad, I don't deserve this," she said through her tears. I looked at her with the same love I had carried since the day she was born. "None of us deserve unconditional love," I replied softly. "That's what makes it so precious." She fell into my arms, hugging me tighter than she had in years. Around the table, several relatives quietly wiped away tears of their own. For the first time that evening, I felt my daughter holding me, not because she expected something from me, but because she remembered who I had always been. Yet as emotional as that moment was, none of us knew that before the night came to an end, Millie would stand before everyone with a confession that would leave the entire room speechless and change the direction of our family's future forever. Millie remained in my arms for several moments, crying so quietly that only I could hear her whispering, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I gently placed my hand on the back of her head, just as I had done when she was a little girl who would run to me after falling off her bicycle. No matter how old she became, that instinct to comfort my daughter had never disappeared. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were red with tears, and she couldn't bring herself to look anyone at the table in the eye. The room was completely silent. Even those who had come expecting nothing more than a pleasant family dinner now understood they were witnessing something far more meaningful. Millie slowly turned toward the guests and took a deep breath. I could see she was struggling to find the right words, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't trying to protect her image. She was trying to tell the truth. "Everyone," she began, her voice trembling, "I owe my father an apology, and I owe all of you the truth." She paused to wipe away another tear before continuing. "When I invited Dad tonight and told him to bring cash, I convinced myself it was just part of the dinner. I kept telling myself everyone was contributing, so it was only fair that he should too. But deep inside, I know that wasn't the real reason." She looked at me for a brief moment before lowering her head again. "The truth is, I became embarrassed by the simple life my father lived. I worried about what people would think when they saw his old truck, his worn-out clothes, and the quiet way he carried himself. Instead of appreciating the man who gave me everything, I started measuring him by the same shallow standards I had begun using to measure everyone else." A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some nodded slowly, realizing they had probably judged me in much the same way. Millie continued speaking, each word sounding heavier than the last. "I spent years chasing success, promotions, expensive dinners, and approval from people who barely knew me. Somewhere along the way, I forgot the lessons my parents taught me. I forgot that the man I was ashamed to introduce to certain people was the very man who worked 2 jobs so I could have an education. He missed vacations, skipped buying things for himself, and sacrificed dreams I never even knew he had. Tonight, he reminded me that real wealth has nothing to do with what's in a bank account." Tears rolled down her face again. "Dad, when I called you and said, 'Bring cash if you want to join us,' I wasn't just asking for money. I was telling you that your presence alone wasn't enough. I can't take those words back, and I'll regret them for the rest of my life." Hearing her admit that in front of everyone broke my heart, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I could see how deeply she was hurting. I walked over, placed my hand gently on her shoulder, and said, "Millie, every person makes mistakes. The important thing is what we choose to do after we recognize them." She nodded slowly and turned back toward the guests. "There's something else I need to do," she said. Without another word, she walked across the room to the donation box that had been the center of so much attention earlier that evening. She picked it up, carried it back to the table, and placed it in front of everyone. "When I organized this dinner, I thought collecting money was the most important part of tonight," she said. "Now I realize it was the least important." She carefully opened the box and removed every envelope that had been placed inside. Looking around the room, she took a deep breath and announced a decision that surprised everyone. Tomorrow morning, with everyone's permission, I'd like every dollar collected here to be donated to my father's charitable foundation. Let this money help families who truly need it instead of paying for another luxury celebration. For a second, no one reacted. Then one guest slowly began to clap. Another joined in. Within moments, the entire room was filled with heartfelt applause. Not for the money, but for the change taking place inside Millie's heart. As I looked around the table, I realized the evening had already become something none of us would ever forget. Yet there was still one final conversation waiting for Millie and me after every guest had gone home. A conversation that would determine whether this emotional reunion would become a lasting new beginning or simply a beautiful memory of one unforgettable night. One by one, the guests began saying their goodbyes. Many of them stopped to shake my hand before leaving. Some apologized for judging me too quickly, while others thanked me for sharing my story. A few admitted that they had become so focused on earning more money that they had forgotten to spend meaningful time with the people they loved most. I told each of them the same thing. Life gives all of us opportunities to change, and the best time to start is today. As the front door closed behind the last guest, an unfamiliar silence settled over the house. The music had stopped, the dining table was covered with empty plates, and the celebration that had begun with excitement had ended with reflection. Only Millie, her husband, and I remained in the living room. Millie quietly walked over and sat beside me on the couch. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence says more than words ever can. Finally, she looked at me with tears still lingering in her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "can you tell me something honestly?" I nodded. "Of course." She took a deep breath before asking, "When did you stop feeling like I was your little girl?" Her question caught me by surprise. I smiled gently and shook my head. "Never," I answered. "You never stopped being my little girl. That's why tonight hurts so much. No matter how old you become, I'll always see the little girl who used to wait by the window for me to come home from work. I'll always remember the child who ran into my arms after school and believed her father could fix anything." Millie covered her face as tears flowed freely again. "Then why didn't you tell me how much I was hurting you?" she asked. I sighed softly. "Because I was afraid." "Not afraid of losing money or being embarrassed?" "I was afraid that if I told you, you'd only call because you felt guilty, not because you wanted to. I wanted your love, not your sympathy." Those words seemed to break the last wall around her heart. She moved closer and held my hand tightly. "I'm so ashamed of the person I became," she admitted. "I kept chasing the approval of people who won't even remember me in a few years, while I ignored the one person who loved me without expecting anything in return." Her husband, who had remained quietly respectful throughout the evening, finally spoke. "David," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology too. I saw the distance growing between you and Millie, and instead of encouraging her to spend more time with you, I stayed silent. I should have done better." I smiled and placed my free hand on his shoulder. "The important thing is that you're speaking now. Families aren't built by perfect people. They're built by people willing to admit when they're wrong and work together to make things right." Millie stood up and disappeared down the hallway for a few minutes. When she returned, she was carrying a small cardboard box. She placed it on the coffee table and slowly opened it. Inside were dozens of old photographs, handmade birthday cards, school drawings, Father's Day crafts, and letters she had written to me when she was a child. I recognized every single one because I had thought many of them were lost years ago. Millie picked up one of the faded cards. Across the front, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "My daddy is my hero." She smiled through her tears. "I found these while cleaning the attic a few weeks ago," she said. "I meant to show them to you, but I kept putting it off because I was too busy." She looked directly into my eyes. "Tonight I realized I almost made the biggest mistake of my life by letting work, money and pride become more important than family." She handed me the card, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Seeing those childish words brought back memories of bedtime stories, school concerts, scraped knees, and laughter that had once filled our little home. It reminded me that beneath all the mistakes, The loving daughter I remembered had never completely disappeared. She had simply become lost. Millie then reached into the box last time and pulled out an old photograph of my late wife. She placed it between us and smiled sadly. Mom always used to say that no matter how far a family drifts apart, love can still find its way home if someone is brave enough to take the first step. She gently squeezed my hand. "Dad, you took that first step tonight. Now it's my turn." I looked at her with hope in my heart, knowing that the words she was about to say would determine not only how our story ended, but how the rest of our lives would begin. Looked into Millie's eyes as she held my hand, and for the first time in many years, I saw the same little girl who used to believe I could solve every problem in the world. The confidence she had built around wealth and status had disappeared, replaced by honesty and humility. She took a slow breath and said, "Dad, I don't want tonight to be remembered as the night I hurt you. I want it to be remembered as the night I finally found my way back to my family." Those words touched me more deeply than any amount of money ever could. I smiled and squeezed her hand gently. "Then don't let this be the end of a conversation," I replied. "Let it be the beginning of a new chapter." She nodded through her tears. "I promise it will be." Millie stood up and walked to the dining table where the framed photograph I had given her was still resting. She picked it up carefully and held it against her chest. "This picture is worth more to me than anything I own," she said. "Every time I look at it, I'll remember the father who never stopped believing in me, even when I gave him reasons to walk away." I shook my head with a gentle smile. A parent's love doesn't disappear because of disappointment. It waits. Sometimes it waits longer than anyone can imagine. Her husband stepped forward and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "David," he said sincerely, "I'd like us to start visiting you every Sunday. Not because we feel obligated, but because we want to rebuild what we've lost. We can't change the past, but we can choose a better future." Hearing those words filled my heart with quiet joy. "I'd like that very much," I answered. Over the following weeks, those promises slowly became reality. The first Sunday they came to my house, we didn't discuss money, inheritances, or regrets. We cooked lunch together in the small kitchen, where Millie had learned to bake cookies as a child. She laughed when she burned the first batch exactly the way she used to years ago. We spent the afternoon looking through old photo albums, telling stories that had almost been forgotten. Before leaving that evening, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I missed this more than I realized." Week after week, our relationship grew stronger. We visited the lakeside cottage together, cleaned the old porch, planted flowers around the entrance, and hung a small wooden sign above the fireplace that read, "Family is life's greatest treasure." It became our tradition to spend one weekend there every month. We left our phones inside, sat by the lake, watched the sunset, shared meals, and talked for hours without distractions. Slowly, the cottage became exactly what I had hoped it would be, a place where love mattered more than possessions. The charitable foundation also began changing lives. We met single parents struggling to provide for their children, elderly people who had been forgotten by distant relatives, and hard-working students whose dreams seemed impossible because they couldn't afford an education. Every scholarship we awarded and every family we helped reminded me of the lesson written in the letter I had inherited. Kindness leaves a legacy that money alone never can. To my surprise, Millie became one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers. She spent weekends organizing community events, meeting families, and listening to stories that changed her perspective forever. One afternoon, after helping distribute school supplies to children, she quietly turned to me and said, "Dad, I spent years believing success meant collecting things. Now I understand that real success is measured by the lives we touch." I smiled proudly because I knew those words came from her heart. Months later, on my birthday, Millie invited me to dinner once again. As I drove to her house, I couldn't help remembering the painful phone call that had started everything. But this time when I rang the doorbell, she opened it with tears in her eyes and wrapped me in the warmest hug I had felt in years. The entire family was waiting inside. There was no donation box near the entrance, no conversations about expensive purchases, and no expectations tied to money. Instead, the walls were decorated with family photographs, including the old picture of us at the county fair displayed in the center of the room. Before dinner began, Millie raised her glass and smiled at everyone. "A year ago," she said, "I made the biggest mistake of my life by believing my father's worth could be measured by what he could bring in his wallet. Today I know his greatest gift was never money. It was his unconditional love, his patience, and the example he set every single day." She turned toward me with tears of gratitude. "Dad, thank you for never giving up on me." I looked around the room at my family, at the laughter, the smiles, and the peace that had returned to our lives. In that moment, I realized my greatest inheritance had never been the fortune left to me by an old friend. It wasn't the properties, the investments, or the legal documents. My greatest inheritance was the chance to heal a broken family before it was too late. Money had opened a door, but forgiveness had brought us through it together. As we sat down to eat, I noticed something that made me smile. My wallet remained in my pocket the entire evening, and not once did anyone ask me to take it out. They simply wanted me there. For an old father named David, who had spent years wondering whether he still mattered, that simple truth was worth more than every dollar in the world. Because in the end, the richest people are not those who possess the most, but those who are surrounded by genuine love, lasting forgiveness, and a family that finally remembers what truly matters. His story was built by Mystery Tales. If you like this video, please response us by comments. Subscribe over channel for more videos. Maybe live happy, maybe live long.